Let's get started. So, is preflop important? I mean, all strategies stem from preflop play, and if you don't get it correct, those errors can snowball on later streets. I'm going to introduce some basic preflop mechanics that'll help you adapt and sharpen your strategy to maximize your win rate. I'll also go into some of the more theoretical aspects that you're not going to find in a lot of other channels, but they may help you think about the spot in a more concise way. So here's the outline. I'm going to go through some basic preflop theory, thresholds, polarity, pricing, time EV, stack depth, the efficient jam principle, the bunching effect, and at the end we're going to look at how to adjust exploitatively to different opponents. Now, let me just get started with the most basic thing I could think of, which is just the blinds. Everything starts at the blinds, right? Let's imagine there were no blinds, no money posted into the pot. How would your range change in that case? Let me see, I think I have a poll somewhere. All right, I've just launched a poll. What do you guys think? Let's say there's no rake, no ante, no blinds. Sorry, I didn't catch that. Can you say again? Open tighter. Yeah, certainly. So everyone agrees you should be opening tighter. The question is how much tighter? And if you think about it, it's essentially betting into a pot with no money is an infinite bet relative to the pot, right? It's kind of mathematically equivalent to betting $1 billion into a 1 cent pot. And if you think about it in that sense, the only hand that should really play is ace-ace. If you plug this into a solver, of course, it will only open ace-ace, but it's programmed to never fold this hand. And you could even argue that opening no hands is correct. It'll be the same EV as opening only ace-ace. Point is that you need money in the pot to incentivize any betting. So what happens is out of position should only defend hands that are better than we open with, and we should only open hands that are better than what they call with. And these two form a feedback loop that leads you to opening aces or nothing. All right, let's go on with this. What we can take away from that little thought experiment is that you need money in the pot to incentivize opening. And the more money in the pot to start with, the more incentive you have to play. That's why ante ranges tend to be wider, for example, or MTT ranges without rake and antes tend to be wider. That's an important mechanic to keep in mind for later spots. Let's talk about thresholds. Now, thresholds are something you should always pay attention to. These hands can be used as markers to identify the break-even parts of your range. Now, that's important because small changes to your opponent's strategy can shift these 0 EV hands negative or positive. So these hands are typically the first to adapt, facing a different strategy. Also, knowing where these 0 EV hands are kind of outlines and sculpts your range and makes it easier to remember, right? You don't have to remember every hand individually, rather you could trace the threshold hands. Now, when it comes to the method of just reviewing your preflop strategy, it's often best to try and reduce it to some color-coded charts as a memorization strategy. I'm sure most 500 NL players have their ranges memorized for the most part, but if you're starting out, one of the simpler exercises you can do is just make a color-coded RFI chart, something like this. For example, right, these hands are open in the low jack, hand like Jack 4 suited is only open on the button. Advantage to this is that you only have to use 1 chart rather than 6. It makes it much easier to remember how to adapt your range by position. And of course, you can do the same kind of exercise with 3 bets as well. For example, small blind facing different positions. Let's move on to polarized versus linear ranges. Now, I'm sure you guys know what polarized and linear means, but just for the video, polarized would mean very strong and weak hands. Linear refers to top-down value and some medium hands. Now, any situation that involves 2 actions, such as raise or fold, for example, a button open or a small blind facing an in-position open if you don't call, those are linear by definition, right? You don't have much wiggle room with any calls, so you're just going to fold the worst hands and continue with the best hands. You just have to be linear. Now, spots outside of that tend to have flexibility to become more polarized, such as a big blind facing an in-position open. In general, in-position tends to polarize harder than out of position. It's true pre-flop and post. Now, as far as combating different strategies go, polarized 3-bets tend to be used to combat raises. That is to say, you have value that's happy to face a 4-bet and bluffs that are easy folds facing a raise. Linear 3-bets tend to combat calls. This range includes value, medium hands, stuff that does well against calls. You want hands with good implied odds, as well as, of course, value. A lot of people have different ideas of what polarized versus linear versus merged looks like pre-flop. And to be fair, it's not quite clear what is a value bet, what is a bluff. So the easiest way to visualize this is just to look at the EV. Now, I'm going to do a couple comparisons here. We're going to take a look at big blind versus button, and we're looking at their 3-bet range specifically. So one of the first things you'll note here is that you have these stronger hands, and of course you have most of these hands that will fold to a raise. We can consider these the bluffs and these the value. And in practice, it's not perfectly polarized, but it becomes more polarized as we increase the bet size. So for example, we can see that the 13 big blind 3-bet is using slightly weaker bluffs than the 11 big blind 3-bet, where it's starting to merge its bluffs a bit more. And at 500 NL, we can see a similar effect, using more polarized strategies with bigger bet sizes and more linear strategies with smaller bet sizes. We can put this into a GIF and just see how that polarization changes as we change the rake and the raise size. And we can see it become more linear and more polar. So, does anyone have any questions from this point? Feel free to type in the chat or just chat up if you have any questions. All right, perfect. Let's go on then. Think about the incentives of different parts of your range. A bluff like Queen 2 suited or Jack 4, these hands are mostly concerned with fold equity. Merged hands like Queen Jack have plenty of easy EV as a flat rather than a 3-bet. And if you raise too large, these hands have poor equity retention, that is to say, your equity against the hands that call you if you raise. At a certain point, these very mergy hands just become better as calls than as raises. Now, polarized strategies, of course, we've said, use this when they tend to 4-bet fold a lot, linear ranges when they tend to call a lot. Alex asks, in practice, is bigger 3-bet better for 500 solely because of rake or because of player pool? I wouldn't say one is particularly better, per se. I would say that 500 tends to be more linear than 50. And that's largely because at the higher rake structure, you're going to get less calls or less folds when you 3-bet, and they'll call more. And so for the same reason, you want to use a linear range if they're calling a lot. You want to use a linear range if the rake dictates that they'll call more. In contrast, if the rake dictates that they should fold more, here we have higher rake, then the strategy tends to become more polarized. Hope that makes sense. So I'm going to move on to blockers. Now, blockers are a pretty important concept that aren't well studied pre-flop. Let's start with a simple example. This is big blind facing a button open. I think it's 500 NL cash game. So by default, they're going to fold 56, call about 30%, raise 13. If you hold ace-ace, you expect them to fold 3% more and call and raise less often. And conversely, if you hold 2-2, you expect them to fold a lot less, call more, and raise more. And so every hand in your range has individual blocker effects against the opponent's ranges. And this can actually have a big impact on your strategy. For example, back in the day, most bluff 3-bets were all these low cards, 7-6 suited, 7-5 suited, 6-3 suited. These hands were preferred for 3-bets for some time several years ago. When solvers came along, they showed that using ace, king, queen, jack kind of hands tend to have better blockers and are preferred as a 3-bet bluff a lot of the time. It's the same reason why we see, for example, these suited hands move, but like queen 10, queen jack, king 10, these hands all have excellent blockers. So these hands can fit into a more polarized strategy as well. Let's try an experiment. It folds to us on the button. We can open 2.5 or fold. Let's assume the blinds can only raise fold and cannot call our bet. They literally can't call. Big blinds got a raising range and a folding range, no calling range. So how should we adjust our opening range on the button? This one's kind of weird. What ends up happening is we get this ridiculous arrow shape. So what it's doing is it knows it's not going to get called. Instead, it's just choosing hands that block raises. Aces, kings, queens, jacks, etc. Right? So, for example, a hand like Jack 5 will never ever see a flop. Either the blinds will fold, or the blinds will raise and Jack 5 will fold. Hands with bad blockers like 2-2 or 5-4 will raise and then call a 3-bet. So they can at least realize some post-flop equity. So here, this is in a way just visualizing the blocker effect. And we can see this effect becomes a little more strong in early position as, for example, hands with an ace or a king will tend to be opened significantly wider. So I want to talk about pricing next. And I think this is something that a lot of people get wrong. Pricing refers to how much a strategy should adjust according to bet size, specifically relating to calls. On the left here, we have big blind versus under the gun min opening. And here we have big blind versus under the gun opening 2.5. And we can see that there is a pretty substantial difference in how wide we call. A lot of people, they'll use one big blind calling range versus, you know, in the big blind versus all under the gun opens, whether they open 3 or 2, they'll just defend the same range. But the truth is that when they open a different amount, your pot odds change, and that's going to affect which hands you should be calling with, even if their range stays the same. One way to visualize this is to create something I call a pricing elasticity chart. Now, there's many different ways you can code this with different colors and symbols and whatnot, but this is what I settled on. 1 is a mixed continue versus a min open. 3 is a continue versus a 3 big blind open. And we have kind of a gradient in between. A good exercise you can try is opening up GTO WiZARD and just comparing your defense against 2 big blinds and against 2.5. Similarly with 3 bets, you can compare how your strategy should change facing different bet sizes or different raise sizes. And you'll be surprised to see just how drastically pricing can affect your calling range. Here's the same one done for button. As we can see, a lot of hands will call a 3 big blind open that, you know, regardless, and we call very, very wide facing a min open. So, of course, these hands are quite sensitive to pricing, and it's something to pay attention to. Now, in MTTs, your pricing is significantly better because there's a 1 big blind ante, more. And what this does is has the effect of lowering the pot odds required to call. So, for example, facing a 2 big blind open in a cash game, you're calling 1 to 4.5, need 22% pot share, not even counting the rake. In an MTT, button opens 2.3. With ante, you actually only need 21% pot share, so it can call even wider, and there's no rake. So always consider how you might adapt your strategy facing different bet sizes. And this goes back to just paying attention to thresholds, right? Like we saw at the beginning. Know which hands are 0 EV facing a bet, facing a raise. Try and pay attention to hands which are right on the line. I guess before I move on, does anyone have any questions about pricing? Feel free to type in the chat or just speak out loud. I see Jeff's mic moving, but I can't hear it for some reason. Anyway, I'm going to move on here. I want to talk about time EV next. This is kind of specific to Zoom fast fold games. These Zoom games create a very interesting incentive. You can attempt to trade big blind per 100 for big blind per hour, right? Let's say you have a win rate of 3 big blinds, right? So king 4, if you open this 100 times, you'll win 3 big blinds. Should you spend time opening these 0 EV hands when you could simply fold and move on to another hand that's actually plus EV? Now note that in a regular game, a non-fast fold game, it doesn't matter whether or not you open it, you still have to wait for the hand to be done. But in a fast fold game, you can get shifted to the next one. Many hands in your opening range are going to be 0 EV or very close to it, and these hands typically add nothing to your win rate but do cost valuable time. So an adjustment you can make is to simply fold marginal hands, specifically in anonymous fast fold games. This idea is, of course, designed to optimize your big blind per hour rather than big blind per 100. Now, one argument against doing this would be that bluffs ensure that your value gets paid off, right? Your opponents can exploit this by simply under-defending, and then you'll have less EV with the value portion of your range. Fide says, I noticed the solver tightens more and more on big blind when more players flat the RFI in front of it. Is that because our equity with marginal hands drops at a higher rate than the improvement on our odds? Yes, precisely. That's exactly right. So, especially when they're flatting tight ranges, you'll want to continue less and less because your pot share just doesn't compete with the improved pot odds. Now, of course, if they're defending too wide, then you might see the opposite effect. You know, if there's a whole bunch of people in there very wide, then all of a sudden you get fantastic pot odds and you'll actually realize a decent share of the pot. So back to time EV here. If you think your opponents aren't going to exploit you by under-defending, you may want to just consider folding a lot of these marginal hands to try and maximize your big blinds per hour. Anonymous Zoom games especially, you can make this adjustment. So let's talk about why you want to open big or small. Now, people open different sizes, and to be honest, there's not a huge EV difference between opening 2.5 versus opening 2 from under the gun, right? However, there is a significant strategic difference. They play very differently. Typically, solvers prefer a smaller opening size from early position and a slightly larger size from late position. In general, if you expect that the table will mostly 3-bet or fold versus your open, then you want to use a smaller size to give them a worse price on a raise. Conversely, if the table is overcalling and under-raising, then generally you want to size up to make them overpay for their equity. Now, when you're opening from early position, in solver land, you actually expect to get 3-bet more often than you expect to get called, depending on sizing, of course. From the late position, it's typically the exact opposite. You expect to get called more than 3-bet. The solver sizing down in early position is really to try and combat raises, combat 3-bets, lose less when it has to open fold, while still being able to bet or raise any amount with its value portion. Let's compare the low jack's expected value when opening hands. On the left, we have a 2 big blind strategy. On the right, we have a 2.5 big blind strategy. Now, if you're just scanning through these one at a time, it's kind of difficult. The overall frequency is almost identical, and the EVs seem very close in a lot of spots. An easier way to look at the data is to simply compare the EV difference between different parts of our range. So the value portion of the range, specifically queens plus and ace queen, these hands actually benefit from a larger size, whereas most of the rest of the range will lose some value, or it was already 0 EV to start with. So sizing up in general costs you more with most of your range, but makes you more at the very top of your range. And so again, if people are overcalling, perhaps you should be sizing up, especially at the top of your range. Anyway, does anyone have any questions about this so far? One thing that surprised me was just how much jacks loses in this configuration. Very interesting. So let's go on to stack depth. Now, as stacks get deeper, hands that can make draws tend to become more valuable. Stacks have the effect of magnifying implied odds, and conversely, as stacks get shallower, hands that can make a strong top pair kind of hand become more valuable, and the implied odds of draws tends to drop off. So here we can see how the 3-bet strategy changes across different stack depths, and we can see the hand slowly shifting from kind of this very polar offsuit heavy thing to more suited hands, more draw heavy hands. Now, I wanted to test this one day. This was a while back. So I designed a little experiment. It's big blind facing a 2.5 big blind open. And this time it's heads up as opposed to 6 max. No rake, no ante, just a straightforward heads up cash game. I wanted to see how the big blind's raise size would change as we change the effective stack. Would they prefer to 3-bet larger, 3-bet smaller? How does that change? So I designed this experiment, and again, we can see it goes from many of these offsuit hands to more of these suited, connected type hands as the stacks increase. And more surprisingly, I found that free bet size tends to actually decrease at a certain point. Big blind actually wants to start using a smaller size. Now, it creates an interesting effect because typically you want, you know, a larger size around 100, 150 big blinds deep, but get a little too small or a little too big and it starts sizing down again. If we take a look at the expected value, we can see that Button's EV, the in-position player, their EV increases as we move up stack depth. And of course, this tells us that the positional advantage gets magnified as stacks get deeper. And in general, late position will RFI wider as stacks get deeper, as more hands are profitable to play in position. So I guess before I move on to this, what questions do you guys have? Looks like this levels off at some point, yeah. Yeah, it does. It does tend to level off. I would imagine that if we kept doing this, we get kind of a graph that approaches some asymptote at the top. That is to say, the positional advantage doesn't grow infinitely. It'll start to get smaller and smaller relative to going deeper and deeper. Why do we 3-bet smaller at 300 plus big blinds? That's a great question. Why is it that you want to 3-bet smaller when stacks are getting deeper? Why does the silver seem to prefer this? And the reasoning that I could come up with is called the efficient jam principle. So shoving is a pretty serious weapon in Hold'em, and hands that shove will always realize their equity. So the silver often fights to give its opponent a bad price on a shove. Now we see this in a variety of spots. We see, for example, min opens or even limps in short stack MTT play. We see min raise or jams in, for example, 75 big blind deep cash games. We see, for example, smaller 4-bet sizes 100 big blinds deep, but then larger 4-bet sizes 200 big blinds deep. Now, in what we've studied, the large 3-bet forces a larger 4-bet, which gives the 3-better a better price on a shove, 100 big blinds deep. That's a little confusing, but to put it another way, 100 big blinds deep, if you 3-bet and they 4-bet, you can guarantee yourself a reasonable price on a 5-bet shove. That is not true 300 big blinds deep. Whereas if we 3-bet and they raise, there's still a lot of money left to go. We don't have that profitable shove. So trying to force a large 4-bet is not so efficient anymore. Are we incentivized to 4-bet bigger the deeper we get, or the same 3-bet principles apply? Yeah, so at 100 big blinds, what ends up happening is the 4-bet is actually very compressed, right? 4-bets are very small, 100 big blinds deep, and that's because you're trying to give big blind, or you're trying to give the opponent a poor price on a raise. As you get deeper, the 4-bets actually become bigger and bigger until they even out at some point. And that's because they're no longer compressed by this 100 big blind stack depth. They have more room to expand and play a more natural, say, pot-sized raise, as opposed to something like a half pot-sized raise. I'm just going to go to GTO WiZARD and explore a few examples here. So, for example, this is 500 NL, simple, button open, big blind raise is 10, and of course, on the button, it either uses an all-in, it just shoves, or it raises this very small sizing to try and give them a bad price on the raise, right? Like if you give the solver like a larger size here, it's just going to be inefficient. It won't really use it. It'll either use a very small size or a shove just to try and be more efficient. And we can go take a look at 200 NL, for example. Big blind raise. And we see the 4-bet size is 38 big blinds, as opposed to the normal, 20 or 25 big blinds. And that's simply because you have more room to expand your raise size without making yourself, without giving them a great price on a shove. Does anyone have any questions about that? All right. So yeah, interesting experiment with stack depth. Let's move on to one of my favorite topics, and this is the bunching effect. People tend to fold low cards more often than high cards, right? And this means that after many folds, we can expect that the deck and the future ranges, the ranges ahead of those folds, will contain, on average, more high cards than low cards. So for example, if under the gun folds, they're more likely to have folded a 2 than an ace, and that shifts the distribution. And this shifting card removal effect is known as the bunching effect. So we can see how this kind of plays out. Over here we have the deck density from ace, king, queen, jack, 10, all the way through 2, as this goes through. So at the start of the hand, everything's even. Under the gun folds, hijack folds, cutoff folds, button folds, and then small blind raises and it evens out. And we can see here that there's going to be more higher cards in the deck by the time it gets the small blind due to the bunching effect. If we compare how this might affect our strategy, we can see on the left, this is when I've solved for a 9-max game, and this is what I've solved for a 3-max game. This is opening on the button. And we can see that, for example, in 9-max, many of these hands with lower cards are simply less preferred, right? 3-max for opening 2s, 5, 3, 7, 4. These hands aren't really in the 9-max range. So that's why, for example, 6-max, you're going to get different results depending on where you get your preflop ranges, because they may or may not have included the bunching effect, which can skew the strategy. Let's say it folds the small blind in a 9-max game. What that means is not only will the deck will be different, but small blind's range itself will also be different. They're not going to be dealt all hands with an equal probability. So, for example, 2-2 would you'd expect to be dealt this much less often than ace-ace. And so if you open any 2 cards from the small blind after a bunch of folds, your range actually looks something like this. Even though strategically it's just any 2 cards, it's actually going to be more top-heavy due to these bunching effects. And if anyone wants to do any more research, I highly suggest visiting this link here, visualizing the bunching effect. This is a blog I helped write with HRC that goes over some of these in more detail. Anyone have any questions about the bunching effect? I guess one question you should have is, does GTO WiZARD account for the bunching effect? And the answer is yes. They purposely include folded ranges from earlier positions so that these card removal effects are accounted for. Not everyone does that, by the way. All right, let's move on to some general preflop adjustments. So in general, to combat raising, you use a more polarized strategy, right? You lose less raise folding bluffs than medium hands. To combat raising, you can also open or bet or raise smaller, right? You lose less because you've bet a smaller amount. And of course, to combat raising, you use bluffs with better blockers rather than better playability. Conversely, we can say, how does one combat too much calling? Well, use a more linear strategy, choose hands with good post-flop playability. You can open and bet larger to overcharge your value. You can use bluffs that have better implied odds post-flop rather than focusing on hands that blocks raises. Fide asks, is this why ace-2 off open folds on late position? Yeah, I mean, ace-2 off, but as it relates to the bunching effect, it's kind of got both, right? You've got the ace, the highest card, and the lowest card, so it kind of feels both ends of the bunching effect at the same time. So, how to adjust? What I'm going to do now is say we're going to run some pre-flop experiments. Folds the button. How should button adjust in these different situations? And I'm going to launch a poll here. This one's easy enough. There's 4 questions on it. How would you guys react in these different scenarios? All right, we got 6 responses so far. Yeah, I mean, the general adjustment is fairly easy, and I think most of you guys got these more or less correct. So, first one, big blind is too tight. Button opens 2.5. The big blind's calling range for their strategy looks like this. So, big blind is calling 10% fewer hands than they otherwise should as compared to the GTO solution. And it's interesting because everyone that voted, they said, yeah, if they're overfolding, just open wider. What are you doing? Of course, right? Because you'll have more fold equity. And indeed, the solver does, opening 60.7%, so opening a lot more hands. And we can see it is focusing on hands that typically have good blockers against the raise because they're still raising quite a bit here. As a size adjustment, you may want to min open, and for that reason, you'll risk less and be able to open even wider as an exploit if they're overfolding, that is. And so that's just a way to minimize your risk in order to maximize your reward. So the opposite scenario, most people said open tighter, which is correct. Someone said open wider. And this is just the exact same thing in reverse. If your hands have less EV stealing the blinds, then they're not going to necessarily be break even or zero EV. They might be negative EV, right? You can always try and justify opening wider with some kind of, post-flop skill edge. But if that skill edge is neutral, you should open tighter if they're defending too wide. And here we can see that button is only opening like 29% instead of 43%, much tighter overall versus this big blind strategy. As a size adjustment, you can actually use a larger size to extract even more value with this tight range, right? The expected value of marginal opens becomes negative if you aren't stealing the blinds often enough. Okay, we've seen that. And the EV of premium hands increases slightly. So, scenario 3, the blinds raise too small. Now, I'm sure you guys have all seen this in your game. Oh, hold on, we've got a question here. Does the positional advantage a factor when big blind opens wider, when they defend wider? Yeah, it's certainly a factor. I mean, in general, if they're defending too wide, then you want to open tighter. If they're defending too tight, you want to open wider. Positional advantage certainly plays a role there, but what I would do is just try and compare their overall defending range to what GTO is, gauge if they're over or under defending relative to that. So in this case, we're going to say the blinds don't raise large enough. I'm sure we've all seen this, right? We opened 2.5, they raised to like 8 big blinds, right? How should the button react to this size without knowing their range? And of course, most people said call wider, someone said call tighter, no one said call the same amount. And yeah, you just call wider. And that's simply because you're getting such great implied odds to see 3 cards. Like 3 cards is a lot of value. Generally, what will happen is you'll overcall preflop and then overfold on the flop. Your positional advantage certainly ties into that. We're in position here, which lets us overrealize our equity. So that's why it's calling so wide. And typically, what some people will do is they'll blast it with a massive 4-bet, but you really don't need a big 4-bet. If we're 100 big blinds deep, for example, you can raise to 18. This is a reasonably large size in percentage pot, while still giving big blind a bad price on a raise. I should also point out that the SPR is considerably higher when they raise this small, so the button will have better implied odds with their draws. It says, one spot that I face all the time in my games is that recreationals 3-bet really small, but also really tight. I'm not sure how to adapt and continue. Yeah, that's a great question, Fide. So we're going to take a look at that very shortly. So scenario 4 will say big blind is a maniac. So in this case, big blind is raising 20% versus your range, right? Just a ton of raising. Now, of course, if they're raising a lot, you guys all voted we should open tighter. And of course, because you have to bet fold a lot of stuff, right? You don't get to realize any of that equity. So that's exactly what we see. The solver defending fewer hands and also shifting away from like these suited connectors towards hands that block raises, right? So again, this is why blockers are important to think about. Here's a bonus scenario that I think Fide will appreciate. So it's 500 NL, 100 big blinds deep. We open 2.5. Big blind raises to 6.5, which is way too small. And also with this jacks plus ace king, ace queen suited super nitty range, right? How do you punish this? How do you adapt this? Well, we know we should continue wide, but at the same time, their range is so value heavy, right? Despite that, the solver is still calling very wide, and more so with hands that are not going to be dominated by like queens, kings, ace, king, aces, stuff like that, right? Like these lower hands will have much better implied odds against that range. And it's quite surprising to see hands like 8-5 suited and 9-6 suited in there. But what ends up happening is that you overcall these hands with great implied odds against overpairs, and then you massively overfold on the flop. This play maximizes your equity realization, getting a great price to cooler old man coffee over here. So hopefully that helps you out. B-Day. So in conclusion, we've only really scratched the surface of many different preflop topics today. I realize you can go a lot deeper in any of these subjects, but just in general, pay attention and be flexible with your threshold hands, right? Know which hands are 0 EV facing a raise or just opening, and be ready to be flexible with those. Develop a sense of pricing. That is to say, you don't want to play the exact same calling range versus every single size. You want to be able to adapt your range facing different prices. And you don't have to be exact with this. Even knowing the threshold hands will let you make good adjustments facing different prices. If you're starting out, use color codes to simplify your memorization. Reducing stuff from 6 charts to 1 really helps you memorize a lot faster. If you play Zoom games, consider your time EV, your big blinds per hour, in contrast to your big blinds per 100. Sometimes in a fast fold game, it's worth it just to skip on to the next hand if the hand is very close to that threshold. Consider your fold equity and your blockers, right? If you're not getting enough steals, if you've got very obvious stations on the table, or if you've got a lot of maniacs, you know, pay attention to, are you blocking raises? Will you get your bet through often enough to open these marginal hands? If not, maybe you want to tighten up a bit, right? And lastly, don't overestimate your post-flop edge. Literally every player at the table thinks they have a post-flop edge. Realistically, you should just try to assume that most of your opponents are going to be roughly the same edge as you are, and you want to play the optimal strategy against an equal opponent. Now, of course, you can factor in post-flop edge, which would just mean you play wider everywhere, but you should be careful not to overestimate that too much. And that's it. That's my lecture. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Thanks for coming, everyone. I really appreciate it. Good luck with your grind.